Friends, the previous lecture came to you from Jerusalem, from just above and beyond the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque. And we spoke about the Prophet's night journey, the tradition of his night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem. At the heart of that lecture was a problem. On the one hand, we have this verse of the Quran, 17:1 from Surah Al-Isra, or the Surah of the night journey. And on the other hand, we have the story of the night journey. And we can approach that in two different ways. On the one hand, we can say, well, this story really explains this verse. Or we could say, this story was produced by this verse, or provoked by this verse. Those who wanted to understand this verse, or provide an understanding for this verse, wrote this story. In this lecture, we're going to examine this problem. How do you approach the relationship between the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the text of the Quran in greater detail? Our goal in doing so, I should say, is not to find the Muhammad of history, but rather to ask, how useful is the traditional biography of Muhammad in the way that we read the Quran? Those interested in the question of our sources for the life of Muhammad, those interested in the question of the Muhammad of history, might read the article by the late Patricia Corona, which is found as one of our readings for this section of the course. But today, in regard to the question of the relationship between the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the passages of the Quran, we're going to look at three different examples, three additional examples that will allow us to enter into this question, which is really critical for our approach to the text of the Quran more deeply. Our first example is Quran chapter 105, or Surah Al-Fil. The word fil means elephant, so this chapter is known as the chapter of the elephant. It's not the only example we have of a chapter named after an animal. We've seen Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, and there's some other animals also in the Quran. There's a spider, there are bees, there are ants. Here we have a very short chapter of just 5 verses, which has something to do with a people of the elephant. Let's read the chapter first, and then we'll speak about its interpretation. Quran chapter 105. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with the people of the elephant? Did he not make their plan go wrong? He sent against them swarms of birds, throwing at them rocks of baked clay, leaving them like chewed up leaves. The surah itself, like so much of the Quran, is general or referential or elusive, and it leaves us with questions. Who were the people of the elephant? What was this elephant? What was their plan? How did their plan go wrong? Who were the swarms of birds? And what were the rocks of clay? How were they thrown at them? In explaining this surah, traditional Muslim scholars have told a story that involves a king named Abraha, who comes from the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula with an army, which includes an elephant, to attack Mecca. The Muslim scholar Wahidi, we've mentioned before, 11th century scholar, says the following about this. He says, this surah was revealed about the story of the owners of the elephant who intended to destroy the Kaaba, and how Allah, exalted is He, dealt with them by destroying them and driving them away from the holy sanctuary. This story is well known. Other scholars, such as Ibn Ishaq, provide more details on this story. They tell the story of how Abraha, this king, wanted to build a cathedral in his home city in the southern parts of the Arabian Peninsula, but he knew that to attract people to his cathedral, he was a Christian, to attract people to his cathedral, he had to destroy the great shrine in Mecca, the Kaaba, which was the center of religious life in the Arabian Peninsula. So according to the story, he led an army to destroy that temple, along with one elephant, and meant to attack Mecca. But when he got close, first his elephant refused to attack. Incidentally, the elephant gets a good Islamic name, Mahmud, because of his refusal to attack. He recognized this as a holy temple, as a temple of Abraham, and refused to go any further. A bit like the biblical story of Balaam, but that's another topic. And God, later, he sent flocks of birds that had rocks that they cast down on the army of Abraha, and they are all destroyed. And the story goes on and says that Abraha himself was pelted by these rocks thrown by birds, and his body was slowly eaten away by all of the wounds and damage done by these rocks. Now, as academic scholars, however, how should we respond to this story? Should we, in fact, use this story to explain this surah? Islamic tradition tells us that this incident took place the year the Prophet was born. The year of the Prophet's birth is known as the year of the elephant because of this incident. Should we, in fact, take this, the story of Abraha, as the explanation for this surah. Now we know, in fact, there was a king named Abraha, so whoever wrote this story, in fact, knew about this king. We know even that this king had ambitious military plans and that he led campaigns into the Arabian Peninsula, a bit like this story. But the problem is, our records of this king indicate that he invaded those parts of the Arabian Peninsula many years before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. There are other questions. Of course, there's the supernatural details. Are we ready to believe this thing about the elephant not entering the city, about these birds and rocks? Even some Muslim scholars don't really like the story of the birds casting down rocks on Abraham's army, and they say maybe this is sort of a metaphor for some sort of pestilence carried by mosquitoes, flying birds, if you will, birds, flying objects, flying animals. We're also suspicious of the way that there's only one elephant involved in the story. Why was it that Abraha had only one elephant? Couldn't he have had at least two elephants? But he has only one. And then we notice that the elephant had to be only one because the Quran, being so interested in rhyme, follows a rhyme of E here. And the word for elephant is fil. And he couldn't have more than one elephant because that would change the rhyme. No longer would the word work with the rest of the surah. So we have a sense that maybe Muslim scholars at a later period wrote this story as a way of explaining Quran 105. Let's go on to another example and see if the same thing applies. This is Quran chapter 9, verse 49. Here we find the Quran declare, "Among them is he who says, 'Excuse me, and do not trouble me.' In fact, they sunk into trouble. In fact, hell will engulf the disbelievers." Now, Wahidi tells a story about how later in Muhammad's life, by this point he was in Medina, he planned a military attack on the Byzantine Christians living to the north at a place called Tabuk. And he was interested in organizing, recruiting soldiers for this attack. And in doing so, he approached a man named Abu Wahab. According to Wahidi, he writes, Muhammad said, "O Abu Wahab, would you not like to have scores of Byzantine women and men as your concubines and servants?" He said, "O Messenger of God, my people know that I am very fond of women, and if I see the women of the Byzantines, I fear I will not be able to hold back. So do not tempt me by them, and allow me not to join, and instead I will assist you with my wealth." The Prophet turned away from him and said, "I allow you." And then God revealed this verse, the verse which says, "Among them is he who says, 'Excuse me and do not trouble me.' In fact, they sunk into trouble." Now, according to the logic of this tradition, Abu Wahab was a hypocrite. He didn't actually fear that he wouldn't be able to withhold himself from the beautiful Byzantine women. In fact, Muhammad actually held out the prospect to him that they could be victorious in this battle and have women as servants and slaves, prisoners of war, along with men. What seems to be the question, or the logic of the account, is that God knew that he was a hypocrite, and so he revealed this verse to tell Muhammad, in a sense, this guy says he's got an excuse for not joining your military campaign, but in fact he's a liar, and hell will engulf the disbelievers. We seem to have the same problem as with Abraha's elephant. Was this story itself a way of explaining the beginning of this verse, which says, "Among them is he who says, 'Excuse me and do not trouble me'? Or was, in fact, this verse connected to a real story that really happened? Was it really someone named Abu Wahab who really said to the Prophet, 'I'm afraid of going to this Byzantine area because I won't be able to hold myself back from their women'?" In other words, is this history, is this a real historical account? Or is this, to use a fancy word, exegesis? Is this actually a way of describing the scripture, in fact? Not history, but something written after the scripture meant to explain it. Well, let's look at one final example, which is the case of Quran chapter 2, verse 119. And this is a fascinating example because this verse can be read in two different ways. And the amazing thing is, we have an individual story for each of the two ways in which this verse can be read. Quran chapter 2, verse 119 reads, "We have sent you with the truth-bringing good news and giving warnings. And according to the standard reading, you will not be questioned about the inmates of hell." There is, however, another way of reading this verse. Instead of reading, "You will not be questioned," the Arabic would be "La tus'al," a variant has, "Do not ask about the inmates of hell," La tas'al. And the remarkable thing is that we have stories for each of these possible variants. The variant according to which the Quran would say, you will not be asked, is told or is explained with the following story. When Muhammad was in Medina, he was preaching his message to all of those in Medina, including the Jews, and he was asking them to accept him as a new messenger, a new prophet. The Jews refused to believe in him, refused to accept his claims that he was a prophet, and therefore Muhammad was overcome with anxiety. He was concerned, why won't this people accept me as a prophet? And God revealed this verse as a way of saying, do not worry about the disbelief of the Jews of this city in Medina. You will not be questioned about the inmates of hell. It's not your responsibility to convince them to believe. You simply proclaim your message, and I will deal with them later. And we can understand how God is going to deal with them. According to the other way of reading this verse, according to which the verse says, do not ask about the inmates of hell, we have something completely different that unfolds. The Prophet Muhammad was worried about his parents, who both died before he began to proclaim Islam. And he was worried about their eternal fate. And so, according to the logic of this passage, what the Quran actually was saying, by having God say, do not ask, was, do not question God about the fate of your parents. That's God's affair, it's not yours. The point is here, not that one way of reading the Quran is right and the other wrong, or one story, let's say the story of the Jews in Medina and Muhammad's concern that they weren't believing, is right, and the other, the story about Muhammad and his parents, is wrong. The story is both, or rather the point is that both of these stories seem to be exegesis, seem to be ways of explaining the Quran. And the remarkable thing about this case is that we have ways of explaining the Quran according to the standard reading of the text and according to the variant reading of the text. Thus, we could see the problem of relying on the medieval biography of the Prophet in our effort to understand the Quran. It is always safer to read the text of the Quran for its own message, to look to the Quran in what it is saying, the internal logic of the Quran. And that is what we will be doing for the rest of this course.